Behind the walls of Royal Lodge, staff were expected to maintain the kind of polished, picture-perfect environment you would expect from a royal residence. But according to people who actually worked around Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, the reality could be very different. Former employees have described a household where tiny mistakes could allegedly lead to angry outbursts, where staff were given extraordinarily specific instructions about Andrew's personal belongings, and where even a collection of teddy bears apparently had its own carefully rehearsed routine. And now, those old stories have suddenly become much more interesting. Because Royal Lodge is no longer Andrew's home. The enormous Windsor property where Andrew lived for more than 2 decades, and which he shared with his ex-wife Sarah Ferguson for years after their divorce, is now part of his past. Andrew has been pushed out to Sandringham, Sarah has virtually disappeared from public view, and their daughters appear to be building lives increasingly removed from the chaos surrounding their parents. So what was it actually like behind closed doors when Andrew and Sarah were still living together at Royal Lodge? Because according to former staff, this was anything but an ordinary household. And some of the strangest stories involve something you probably wouldn't expect. Andrew's teddy bears. Yes, teddy bears. Former Buckingham Palace maid Charlotte Briggs previously claimed that Andrew owned an enormous collection of stuffed toys, reportedly around 72 at one point. But it wasn't simply the number of bears that made the story so bizarre. It was what staff allegedly had to do with them. According to Briggs, the bears had to be arranged in a particular order on Andrew's 4-poster bed, with the largest at the back and the smallest toward the front. And apparently, you couldn't just figure it out as you went along. Briggs said she was given an entire day's training on how Andrew wanted the collection arranged. There was even reportedly a laminated guide showing staff exactly where certain toys belonged. Former Royal Protection Officer Paul Page separately recalled seeing instructions showing where the stuffed animals should be placed. According to his account, if the arrangement wasn't right, Andrew could become extremely angry. Think about that for a second. This wasn't a child whose parents wanted the stuffed animals put back neatly before bedtime. This was a grown man, a former Royal Navy officer and one of the late Queen Elizabeth's sons, with palace employees reportedly being trained on precisely where his teddy bears needed to go. And according to Briggs, the routine didn't end in the morning. At night, the bears had to be moved again so Andrew could get into bed, with certain favourites reportedly remaining close by. But the teddy bears are really only one part of the story, because former employees have painted a broader picture of a man who could be incredibly demanding about his surroundings. Staff accounts over the years have described Andrew as impatient, entitled, and prone to losing his temper. The impression that emerges isn't simply of someone who liked things done properly. Plenty of people are particular. It's the level of control that allegedly made working around him so difficult. Clothes, bedrooms, personal belongings, and daily routines all had expectations attached to them. And staff reportedly knew that getting something wrong could mean facing Andrew's anger. That atmosphere becomes even more striking when you remember what Royal Lodge actually was. This wasn't a small private home. Royal Lodge is a huge 30-room property on the Windsor estate. Andrew lived there for more than 20 years, and despite divorcing Sarah Ferguson all the way back in 1996, the former couple eventually ended up sharing the property for years. It was one of the strangest arrangements in the royal family. They weren't husband and wife, but they weren't exactly living separate lives either. They repeatedly described themselves as an unusually happy divorced couple, remained extremely close, appeared together publicly, and continued sharing this enormous royal residence. Sarah's relationship with staff, however, appears to have been somewhat different from Andrew's. People who encountered her during her earlier royal years often described her as much more informal, energetic, and approachable. But there were also reports that she could be emotional and unpredictable, particularly when she was under pressure. Former staff accounts have portrayed Sarah as someone who could be warm and friendly one moment, then overwhelmed or quick-tempered the next. Yet there is another side to this. Some accounts have suggested Sarah occasionally acted as a calming influence on Andrew. After decades of knowing him, she reportedly understood how to manage his moods better than almost anyone. And perhaps that helps explain why their bizarre living arrangement lasted as long as it did. They divorced. They dated other people. They endured scandals, financial problems, and years of relentless negative headlines. But somehow, Andrew and Sarah kept coming back to one another. Royal Lodge became the physical centre of that relationship. Whatever else happened outside those gates, they still had that house. Until they didn't. Because the situation has changed dramatically. Andrew is no longer fighting to remain at Royal Lodge. He is gone. In February 2026, Andrew moved out of the Windsor property and relocated to the King's privately owned Sandringham estate in Norfolk. He initially stayed at Wood Farm Cottage while work was completed on Marsh Farm, a far more modest property than the sprawling mansion he had occupied for decades. And that move is significant. For years, the question was whether Andrew could actually be forced out. His lease had given him substantial protection, provided he met its conditions and maintained the property. But after years of controversy and renewed scrutiny surrounding his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, Andrew's position within the royal family deteriorated dramatically. Eventually, Royal Lodge was lost too. And the contrast between his old life and his new one could hardly be greater. Recent reports have described Andrew as increasingly isolated at Sandringham, spending much of his time walking dogs, watching television, and remaining largely removed from wider royal life. There have even been reports this month that Andrew declined an invitation to join the royal family at Balmoral, apparently feeling he would be treated as an outsider if he went. For a man who once occupied one of the grandest homes on the Windsor estate and enjoyed all the privileges that came with being the Queen's son, it is an extraordinary reversal. But perhaps the most interesting part of the collapse of the Royal Lodge household is what happened to Sarah. Because she didn't go with him. After years of sharing a home despite being divorced, Andrew and Sarah finally went their separate ways. And Sarah's life since then has become surprisingly mysterious. She has largely vanished from public view. In fact, Sarah has not been publicly photographed for months. She was spotted in the Alps earlier this year, but since leaving Royal Lodge, she has kept an extraordinarily low profile, with conflicting reports about where exactly she has been staying. That became particularly noticeable this month. On August 3rd, Princess Eugenie gave birth to her third child and her first daughter in Lisbon, Portugal. The baby girl, Adelaide Elizabeth Anina Brooksbank, joins Eugenie's sons August and Ernest. It should have been one of the happiest moments imaginable for Sarah, becoming a grandmother again and finally welcoming a granddaughter through Eugenie. But even then, Sarah remained out of sight. Recent reports have raised questions about whether she travelled to Portugal at all following the birth. That is a remarkable change for someone who, for years, seemed determined to remain visible and connected to royal life. And it also shows just how completely the old York family setup has fractured. Andrew is now living at Sandringham. Sarah is largely out of public view. Eugenie is spending significant time in Portugal with Jack Brooksbank and their 3 children. And Beatrice has continued building her own family life with Eduardo Mapley Mozzi, the 4 people who once seemed permanently connected through Royal Lodge and now scattered. Which brings us back to those stories from the staff. At the time, tales about teddy bears, laminated diagrams and angry outbursts could almost sound like strange royal gossip. Now they feel like snapshots from a completely different era. The former employees who once had to navigate his routines have provided an extraordinary glimpse of what life was apparently like when Andrew still lived at the centre of that privileged world. So what do you think? Do these former staff stories change the way you see Andrew and Sarah's life behind closed doors? And more importantly, do you think Sarah Ferguson will eventually return to public life? Or have we finally reached the end of the Andrew and Fergie era? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and subscribe for more updates on the royal family.